Hey guys, how's it going? Devin here. So today I thought it would be a good idea to show you guys my Blu-ray collection. Now, obviously, these aren't all of my DVDs and Blu-rays, but these are the ones in particular that I am most proud of. So let's get started. So the first one I have here is Inception. Now, Inception is officially my favorite movie of all time. I remember seeing it for the first time in theaters with my grandma at the 9:30 showing, and I was simply blown away. This is such a well-made movie. I probably have seen this maybe 15 times, and still I'm finding new things every time I see it, and it basically gets better every time I see it. Christopher Nolan is a filmmaking god. The acting in this movie is wonderful. The editing, the writing, everything. This is a great, well-rounded movie. I'd give this 11 out of 10. This is a great sci-fi movie. It's so funny to see Tom Hardy as a funny British man in this movie, and then 3 years later, he plays Bane, who is one of the most intimidating criminals of all freaking time. Inception, if you haven't seen it, you are literally out of your mind. Go see it ASAP. Next up, we have Source Code, and this stars Jake Gyllenhaal and Duncan Jones, the director of Moon. This movie is kind of Inception-esque. It's got that kind of psychological style to it. Great sci-fi movie. Has some problems, but I'd say I recommend you watch it at least once. Great movie. Now we have Scott Pilgrim. Now this movie is my geeky, guilty pleasure. I love this movie. The first time I watched it, I wasn't really paying attention, and I didn't really appreciate it. About a year later, I watched it again, and I just completely fell in love. This is a great example of good editing. This movie has the best editing transitions I have ever seen in my life. The visual effects are outstanding. It's really cool to see Michael Cera in more of a action star kind of role instead of his geeky, sort of nerdy, high-pitched kind of character that he usually plays. The 7 evil exes in this movie look like they're just having such a fun time in their roles. Chris Evans plays a cocky action star, and he is awesome in this movie. Not in it for a long time, but he's awesome. Everybody has such a fun part in this movie. It's so entertaining to watch. I could watch this every day. I swear, this movie is just so entertaining, so action-packed. This movie, I think, is really underrated, too. I don't think it bombed in the box office, but I think this got overrun by Vampire Suck in the box office. If that's not a criminal act, I don't know what is. This movie is fantastic. I love this movie. Next up is Zombieland. Now, this is another guilty pleasure of mine. I feel like every time I finish this movie, I feel a little dirty inside because it's just so dark, but yet it's just so entertaining. Woody Harrelson is so funny in this movie. This whole movie is just hilarious. And the rewatchability factor on this movie is insane as well. I could probably watch this movie 3 times in a day. It's so good. It's not very long. It's actually about 90 minutes long. You should give credit to this movie because at parts they have lighthearted moments that actually work. So if you can do that in a zombie slaying movie, you must be doing something right in your directing style. Ruben Fletcher is the director of this movie, and he hasn't really come out with many other movies other than this one, and I think 30 Minutes or Less, which is also with Jesse Eisenberg, but he has shown that he can direct dark comedies pretty dang well. So if you haven't checked out Zombieland, check it out. It's pretty funny. Next up, we have Alien. Now, this movie was made in 1979. It's the director Ridley Scott. It stars Sigourney Weaver, and this movie is really, really great. People have said that this movie is kind of slow, which I can somewhat understand, but that's not a real problem for me because everything that happens in this movie, all the conversations between the characters are so well written that I'm still invested in them. A lot of people like Aliens more than Alien, but I like both of them equally. They're both fantastic films. Alien is more of a horror movie. Aliens is more of an action movie, and this movie is really well made, and I think for its time, it was a landmark movie. The scene where the alien pops out of the guy's chest is pretty gruesome, actually. For its time, it was made in 1979, so that might have really disturbed a lot of viewers back then. Surprisingly, time hasn't hurt this movie too much in that it was made more than 30 years ago, so props to this movie. Go see this movie if you haven't. It's a great film. And obviously, next up is Aliens, which is the sequel to Alien. The caption on the front is, "This time it's war." And yeah, that caption couldn't be more valid. This is action-packed from frame one to the end. It is Armageddon for alien movies, and it is really well made. It kept me invested throughout the whole movie, and I loved it. I remember my palms were sweating at a point because I was so invested in it. You care about the characters, you don't want them to die. A lot of characters in the Alien franchise do die, but that still doesn't detract from the movie. Like I said before, I like Aliens just as much as Alien, but this movie is definitely more action-packed. So if you're into that sort of thing, I'd say Aliens would be better for you than Alien. But both movies are great, this movie is great, so yeah. Next up, we have Chronicle. This is one of my favorite movies of all time. I absolutely adore this movie. The character development in this movie is outstanding, and it introduces one of the most talented actors that we have today, Dane DeHaan. If you haven't seen it, it's a found footage film about 3 teenagers who go under this one hole that has this radioactive material that gives them superpowers. The main character, Dane DeHaan's character, lives in a pretty underprivileged neighborhood. His dad beats him, his mom is dying, so he takes this power for granted and uses it towards bad instead of good, and you'd think that a found footage film would detract from any character development. This movie has one of the best structured character development, most specifically for Dane DeHaan's character. You feel deeply for Dane DeHaan's character due to the fact that his mom's dying, and most of the bad things that he does with his superpowers is for a good cause, to save his mom. This movie's 82 minutes, which you'd think would be extremely short, but I think if it would have been any longer, I think it would have been a little too overdrawn. So the length of this movie is actually pretty perfect. This movie is great because it was really thinking outside the box. They finally used found footage the way that it's supposed to be used. You know, usually when you watch a found footage movie, you think to yourself eventually in the story, why would that person still be holding a video camera at this point of crucial time? But the movie gets really creative on how it uses its found footage gimmick, and it works really well. It's the first unique found footage movie that has come out in the past 5 years. Since Paranormal Activity came out, there's been a lot of bad found footage horror movies like The Devil Inside or The Last Exorcism, so this kind of got out of the status quo and did something pretty original and unique, so you should check this movie out. Next up, we have Cloverfield. This is another found footage movie. This was made in about 2006. To me, this movie was inspired by 9/11 in a way because a lot of the shots seem very similar to the shots when 9/11 occurred. For example, all the shots that we saw of debris flowing through the streets after the 2 towers collapsed in 9/11. Once the Statue of Liberty's head hits the ground, then there's a lot of debris from buildings running through the streets. There's just a lot of implied stuff in this movie that relates to 9/11. Again, another great investing found footage movie, thinking outside the box of what found footage is most likely used for, which is horror movies. This movie is more of a disaster movie, and it does really well in making you feel for the characters. Some characters are eliminated. It's very unpredictable. I was really impressed. I was really impressed with this movie. The Blu-ray itself, I don't think is at its best quality, but because it's a found footage movie and it's supposed to be used with cheap video cameras, I think it gets away with it a little bit. But other than that, this is a great movie, and if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. Next up, we have The Fighter. Now, this movie stars Mark Wahlberg, Christian Bale, and Amy Adams, and it's directed by David O. Russell, and I absolutely love David O. Russell's movies. I love Silver Linings Playbook. All of his movies are so diverse. That's what I love about him. David O. Russell's coming out with a new movie, too, that comes out this Christmas with Christian Bale, Bradley Cooper, Jennifer Lawrence, Robert De Niro, a lot of people, and I think it has to do with war. I can't exactly remember the plot synopsis, but he does so many diverse movies. His directing style is so unique in a good way. The Fighter has somewhat of a dirty, kind of gritty tone to it, and I love it. And again, David O. Russell's movies are character movies, so you care about all the characters in this movie. The movie is based on true events, and it takes place in the 90s, so you get a lot of great classic rock songs in it. Christian Bale does a stellar job in this movie. He plays a crack addict. You can definitely tell from this movie that he is 100% a method actor. No one who is not a method actor could pull it off as well as Christian Bale. He's completely transformed himself. He loses weight and then he gains it back and then he loses it and gains it again. You'd think that would be a bit exhausting. In The Machinist, he is unhealthily thin. He's like a human skeleton in that movie. And then he had to muscle up for Batman Begins, and then he loses it again to play a crack addict in The Fighter, and then he just muscles up again for The Dark Knight Rises. He is a very committed actor. Kudos to him. He's one of my favorite actors of all time, so Check out The Fighter. Next up, we have my childhood in a case, the original Star Wars franchise. I have nothing bad to say about these movies, other than the Ewoks. My favorite movie, like a lot of people, is Empire Strikes Back. It is a masterpiece, along with all the other ones. But there's something about the Empire Strikes Back that just sticks out. Plus, the Blu-ray conversion on these movies are pretty good overall. A New Hope is okay. It's not the best Blu-ray conversion ever, but you know what? It's Star Wars, you can forgive it. Empire Strikes Back naturally has the greatest conversion just because of the fact that it's the most famous of the three. Overall, all of these have really good quality. I actually hadn't watched these movies in like 4 years, and I got this for my birthday, and I sat down and I had a Star Wars marathon, and I watched all 3 in a row in the whole day. I realized that when I was a kid, I only watched these movies for the lightsaber fights, and I never really looked at the story. And finally, when I sat down and actually watched for its plot and its acting and its editing and directing, I realized how well crafted these movies are. These movies are obviously a big part of movie history. These movies were so monumental when they came out in the 70s and 80s, and they still live up to the hype today. So if you haven't seen any of the Star Wars movies, I mean, have you been living under a rock? Next up, we have Hugo, and this movie is directed by Martin Scorsese, and this movie shows that Martin Scorsese can make a fantastic movie without any violence in it. The movie is PG, it's lighthearted, it's actually surprisingly complex, it's a great story. Aja Butterfield does a great job in his performance as the main character. He was also in A Boy in the Striped Pajamas. He does a wonderful job, he is a fantastic actor. As well as Chloe Martez, she did a great job as well. Although my favorite performance from her will always be Hit Girl from Kick-Ass. Ben Kingsley is in this movie as well, he does an awesome job. And Sacha Baron Cohen is in this movie, and he is a really good dramatic actor. This movie was nominated for 11 Academy Awards, and for good reason. I personally believe this movie should have won Best Picture over The Artist. I love The Artist, don't get me wrong, but I believe the Academy Awards picked that for Best Picture just because it was relevant for the time, but I think this movie will live up as a better movie in the long run. Plus, the cinematography in this movie is outstanding. It has almost like a magical feel to it, almost dreamlike. It takes place in Paris in the 1940s, I think. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But it has such a dreamlike feel to it. It's a really well-crafted movie, so check it out. Next up, I have The Artist, which did win Best Picture over Hugo. This movie is very unique in the sense that it is a black and white silent film that was made in 2011 that won Best Picture, along with 4 other Academy Awards. Alright, I'm gonna try to pronounce the main actor and actress of this movie. Jean Dujardin, I think that's it. Berenice Bejo, not sure if that's it, but Jean Dujardin and Berenice Bejo. Go see The Artist. Next up is my favorite 80s comedy of all time, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. This might also be my favorite John Hughes film of all time. Matthew Broderick was born for this role. This is a brilliant character. This movie is charming, funny, and even heartfelt as well. Again, if you haven't seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, what are you doing with your life? Next up, we have The Woman in Black starring Daniel Radcliffe. I don't care how much Daniel Radcliffe tries, he will always be Harry Potter in every role he plays. I'm not saying he's not a diverse actor, but that face will always be Harry Potter. I think a lot of you will say that as well. Now, this movie has a lot of legitimately scary parts. I was actually surprised to see how scared I actually was. The fact that this movie can give you goosebumps and only be PG-13 is pretty impressive. Now, obviously, there are some slow parts and some jump scares, but overall, this movie is a pretty good watch. I recommend you watch it at least once. Check out Woman in Black.